Hello and welcome back to Vox Terra, aka Hidden Agendas. So let's take a look at some of those possible hidden agendas that could be influencing the US's or our attack, massive attack now that we're launching on Iran. Extremely distressing. And in fact, I find it so distressing, this video may be a bit longer than I'm hoping, so you may just want to listen to it as if it's a podcast, meaning do your dishes while you're listening or take a drive, whatever. So first, before we launched the invasion, just before the attack, just before, Tom Scahill of Dropsite News, I heard him interviewed, and formerly The Intercept. I heard him interviewed on Democracy Now!, and he pointed out that the Iran is really the only nation state that offered any actual limited military support to the Palestinians in response to Israel's ongoing attacks of that population in Gaza. And is that really why they're the bad guys? That's an interesting question. This attack, like all others, really is in my opinion, is coming out of this one-sided media narrative environment where the enemy is the enemy. And then the question is, the more liberals or doves, if you want to call them that, are like, well, we should just boycott them or maybe try to engage them to change them, but they're still the enemy. Or you got the hawks, the neocons, which now Trump has turned out to be. If we're just going to bomb them, kill them, and regime change the thing. And largely, my fellow Americans just seem to be going along with that, rather than questioning, do these people really need to be our enemy? Are they really our enemy? Isn't this kind of arbitrary? And second to that problem, the economic interests just largely go unexamined or little examined. And if you think about it, and this would really snap you out of your war fever if you have any, is these wars always seem to serve, they always serve the defense industry, direct, indirect, they're serving that industry. And that's an industry that gives millions to American politicians every year, and I'm sure has a lot of ties to media outlets. And they all always seem to support the fossil fuel petrochemical industries. And generally, they're about privatization in general. We could view the whole anti-Soviet, anti-communism as supporting a privatization agenda. And that's really the heart of it. You ask yourself the question, who profits, who dies? So Iran, but Cuba too, because they're next on the hit list, it looks like. Over my whole lifetime, we're told they're the enemy. They're a regime, quote, this almost Pavlovian word, regime. You toss out the word regime and everybody's supposed to start getting their war fever up. Don't call them a government, call them a regime. Well, what the heck's a regime versus a government anyway? And these easy narratives are just facilitated by our lack of knowledge about the countries and our lack of real attempt to get knowledge. So Iran, well, let's think about it first of all. How does their government actually work there? We've heard in the background in the news that they have elections there. If you've been following it in the background long enough, like I have, well, you've heard sometimes the opposition has won. So they do have an opposition that has won elections. Then there seems to be this steady theocratic background. Almost like, is it a check in a system of checks and balances? I don't know. We don't know. We're not really told about it. We're not really exploring it, how exactly it's set up there. Is it kind of like a constitutional monarchy, maybe the equivalent of the English constitutional monarchy back when the monarchy had more power, but there was still a House of Commons and a House of Lords? Is it something like that? These theocrats hold some type of check or sway on the government, but they have had elections. The opposition has won. And then we would hear in the news background when they're losing, sometimes the doves within our media outlets would say, well, they're losing because of the US's aggressive posture, because of all these sanctions and us going around getting people to join in the sanctions against them, our aggressive posture. So what are the actual mechanics of their elections? Well, little talked about, little discussed. Now, back to that Tom Scahill, he also pointed out that there was a fatwa issued some time back saying Iran's not going to be doing nuclear weapons. And he had said, well, yeah, people are going to dismiss that fatwa, saying it's just Iranian propaganda, because that's all we do is just dismiss. We don't really explore their side of things. But he pointed out that there was a lot of controversy within Iran about saying we're not going to have nuclear weapons because they felt they're leaving themselves vulnerable to attack. And here we could look at the Libyan example. Well, think about this. Muammar Gaddafi, long time on the enemy list, then one day decides he's going to play ball with the so-called West, get rid of his any WMD program. And what was the thanks he got for that? NATO allies came in and did air support for all of the various armed groups who wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. And I'm sure included within there were Islamicists. Well, here we're told that we need to get rid of Iran because, they support terrorists or the Iranian regime, the Iranian government, they're human rights abusing. Again, it can feel kind of arbitrary because look at the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, our so-called allies over there, and why they're our allies and Iran's not our ally and it's our enemy instead. It feels arbitrary. And maybe we should question the arbitrariness of it. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, these are all oil-rich Gulf states. We all sort of know that. We also know in the background there's human rights abuses there. We heard in Saudi Arabia about Jamal Khashoggi, the reporter being murdered who was criticizing the Crown Prince. We also know in our media background there's all kinds of human rights reports about very exploited immigrant labor in those oil-rich Gulf states who are there on temporary visas, basically doing all the, quote, dirty work, which can sound a little bit like some of the labor conditions in our own country with our agricultural workers. We know these are not exactly free places. Now, Israel, we're told, well, that's a democracy, but then again, we're also going to be hearing very credible human rights reports on Israel about them having an apartheid-like system. I think just even in the background of our news reports, which don't really emphasize the humanity of the Palestinians living in the West Bank or Gaza, but even just hearing the numbers, we are hearing these constant stories about settler attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, the just, killing, wholesale slaughter of Palestinians that was going on throughout this war in Gaza. But even before the war, the sort of choking off of the people in Gaza, getting very little attention. But I would say there, we could really say our allies all don't exactly have clean hands either, nor do we. Well, this support for militants or support for terrorism, that's another much murkier, muddier situation than our media and our politicians and thus the dominant thinking in our public is understanding or letting on to. Look, really underreported was that Israel supported Hamas against the Palestinian Liberation Organization within Gaza and the West Bank, I believe. Well, Hamas is a more Islamicist militant organization. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was more coming out of a sort of a left or a Ba'athist party, separation of church and state, or mosque and state, if you will, Arabic Middle Eastern movement. The U.S., we supported the mujahideen in Afghanistan, which gave birth to the Taliban. And everybody knew it at the time, yet our whole media portrayed these Islamicists, very conservative Islamicists, as freedom fighters going against what I imagine was the much more progressive, Soviet-friendly government in Afghanistan. Here, too, in Syria, we supported, very little examined in our media, but we supported the overthrow of the Syrian so-called regime. Well, and a lot of their brutal crackdowns really started once we were sort of fueling everything there. And what's the result of that is now a former ISIS leader is in charge. So couldn't you say here again, we in Israel are supporting the more Islamicist movements, but while at the same time saying we're for a more progressive society? So what the heck is going on with Iran then, in that, yes, they have this theocratic state, but we've supported people who are far more extreme than the Iranian Revolution? It really all, again, feels really arbitrary and should give us all a lot of pause before attacking and before bombing. And in some ways, I think we could see this as a massive media, and then the public goes along with it. So I don't want to just blame the media, because then the politicians grow up in this media environment. But it's a massive gaslighting of our so-called enemies. It's a massive gaslighting of the Islamic world. And so let's look at it this way. We've been supporting these jihadist movements, right? Israel supported Hamas. We supported the mujahideen. We provided air cover for the Libyan uprising. We provided support for the Syrian uprisings. And now we've been helping replace all these like Ba'athist and more leftist governments that were more progressive with women and issues and that those social causes, we've been overthrowing them and then helping these jihadists come to power, and then we say, oh, look at how backwards they are. These backwards, cretins with these jihadists, which we helped bring them there. And then you see the popular uprisings, the protests in Iran. But again, keep in mind, though, that these are protests arising out of a nation that has been sanctioned by the U.S. for decades. We've been going around telling people, don't buy from them, don't sell to them, don't buy from them, don't sell to them, crippling their economy. And I'm sure there's all sorts of covert support for people uprising within the country in terms of propaganda and probably in terms of weaponry, I'd imagine. And I believe some of those protests in Iran were or are armed and were engaging in acts of destruction. Well, what nation that's been under decades long of economic sanctions where people are really suffering isn't going to be vulnerable to massive uprisings? We can see the fault lines in our own country. And isn't that another form of gaslighting? Love that word today. Hey, look at how incompetent this government or this regime is. Look, we've gotten everyone to go around and boycott them, bankrupt them, and now look, they can't even manage their own economy, right? That was the story in Venezuela. That's the story in Cuba. That's the story in Iran. Look, hey, everybody, join us. Don't buy from them. Don't sell to them. Look how incompetent they are. We better go in and blow them up now. Okay, how did Iran become a theocracy in the first place? Well, this is a really undertold story. I remember a little kid here, because I've been paying attention the whole way through, when the Iranian Revolution happened, they see some Americans as hostages, and it was just portrayed to me as these crazy Iranians, these crazy theocrats, these crazy Ayatollahs, monsters. But they didn't tell me at the time. The media narrative left it out. I didn't learn it until years and years later when I was in college, that we, U.S. and CIA and MI5, supported a coup in Iran in the 1950s to overthrow a democratically elected socialist who was probably kind of like a Bernie Sanders or maybe a Mamdani in New York City, after he had the nerve to nationalize the oil industry. Well, pretty darn similar with Venezuela, isn't it? The guy nationalized the oil industry. I believe there was compensation, as there was compensation in Venezuela. But, regardless, isn't that a country's prerogative to say we don't want, capitalism? We want to have the means of production, or we want to have the resources publicly owned? Isn't that their prerogative? And I'm assuming they offered some kind of compensation, but that's not good enough. Dirty commie, get him out of there. Coup. And you find support in the Iranian public. I saw the pictures from that time period, the 50s. Years later, I saw people taken to the streets supporting who we were putting in, the Shah. Well, again, back to my childhood, that Shah was portrayed as basically a nice man. Left out of the narrative was that he was brutal. It was a brutal regime. There was tortures to keep that, quote, Western oil industry friendly Shah in power. It was brutal. So basically this Iranian Revolution comes out of that. And it's sort of like they're saying, hey, you know what? The left couldn't keep the foreign powers out of our country. Well, let's give these more traditionalist elements a shot at it. And they did, right? There's been no foreign troops on Iranian soil for how long? No foreign U.S. military bases. That's been, in a sense, their own country for a darn long time now. And Trump, wants to be the guy who ends that once and for all. Only he's not seeing it that way. He's seeing it from the dominant media viewpoint. If we go back further in history, Iran is one of the sites of ancient civilization. We all kind of know that in the background. If you read the Bible, you might know about, I think there was a Persian emperor mentioned in there, Cyrus the Great, who was very kind to the Jews, who I believe were a lot of them were living in Iran at the time after they had left somewhere else. So I'm assuming the Persian Empire then predates ancient Judea. So this is a place of ancient civilization that we could learn a lot from, that's far older than we are. And one interesting thing in the ancient times there was they had these ancient low-tech cooling systems that for cooling their buildings in the desert that, I saw those popping up on YouTube for a while. The point being, there's so much we could learn from the world But instead, we're just blowing it up. And the other point being, those ancient cooling systems. Well, I guess what you don't need if you got a low tech way to cool your building, you don't need to be burning fossil fuels, do you? See, it's coming back to this serving these dominant industries. Another interesting aside I thought with her history is there was an Iranian grad student I knew who told me that the reason they changed the name to Iran from Persia was there was a Persian king or a leader at some point who I think he wanted to emphasize their ties with the Aryan tribes that a lot of historians or linguists believe sort of branched out from Central Asia and settled what's modern Germany and settled modern Iran to show, hey, we have this commonality with you guys in Europe. Well, that's interesting too if you think about it. Now, who we're teaming up with and who we're bombing and who's left and who's right and who's conservative and who's liberal. So Trump's apparently calling the Iranian people to rise up. Well, after you've heard everything I had to say, you could see how the people that do rise up might be viewed by some within Iran as siding with a foreign power. And I don't see how this is going to go down well. So far, none of these regime changes have gone well anywhere in the Middle East. They're all, basically, we've turned these countries all into hellholes. And then it's interesting to look at this Iran calling the U.S. the great Satan and people getting really guffaw about that. But, well, let's just look at it from a biblical standpoint, right? In the Gospels of Christ, Jesus talked about you can't serve two masters, money and God, something like that. You're going to either serve one or the other. There's the talk about Jesus being in the desert and tempted by the devil and offered all the riches and power in the world. So and Jesus was always shown to be standing up to these Pharisees or the sort of rulers of the society. And there's a saying there, blessed are the meek, the meek shall inherit the earth. As you do to the least among you, so you do to me. So us running around the planet, getting other nations to join in these like sanctions and aiming their guns at other countries and helping topple them, it definitely feels like the strong picking on the weak. It definitely, and the fact that it always serves these really big industries like fossil fuel, petrochemicals, and we're making alliances with these wealthy Gulf Arab states, it feels like we're giving into that wealth and power. Now, next on it, conservative Americans are somehow thinking Muslims are their enemy. Well, right in the Quran is a whole chapter. I'm not sure how you refer to in the Quran, but it's about Jesus. And like a Muslim friend of mine pointed out, the Quran is Islam is the only religion on the planet besides Christianity that acknowledges Jesus. And when I was trying to read the Quran a bit in English, obviously, not in Arabic, but I remember reading about all the people of the book, are acceptable to God. And so we're trying to topple this like theocratic government, or has some type of theocratic element. And really, in a way, didn't a lot of American conservatives would like a more godly society? So couldn't this be seen now as an attack on conservatives? And what are the American values we're promoting, right? So it's not just the Bible. Hey, you're doing this for like wealth and power and riches. It looks like you're picking on a much weaker country. You're getting everybody to gang up on them. It looks like, but also you're promoting an anti-traditionalist, anti-conservative agenda on top of it. So that's some pretty interesting food for thought, I would hope, and I hope I got some conservative listeners listening at this point. Well, other than to say, I think the best solution would be a robust United Nations, because I don't think they would tolerate us just acting like this. I don't know really what's to stop us until the public kind of wakes up and realizes there's more to the story here, people. Don't accept who we're told the enemy is all the time. And most of these like us versus them narratives, it doesn't serve us, okay? It serves these dominant industries, and it seems like it's always fossil fuel, petrochemicals, and defense industry coming out on top. So, how about we don't attack Cuba next? Does that sound good to people? All right, hey, well, as always, until next time, thanks for listening, thanks for subscribing, thanks for commenting. Please check out revolutionarygraphics.org for some neat political protest t-shirts, I guess you could call them. And as always, until next time, peace be with you. Thanks. Bye.